Okay, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name's Dan O'Connor. I am the head of delivery at Earley Information Science, and I'm also the director of our product data practice here at EIS. And I've been in product data in various capacities for over 20 years now. So this is our first webinar in a series that we're dedicating specifically for mastering product data. And every month I'll be bringing new guests in to be able to talk about product data and everything that goes around it, the theories, the challenges, the new tools, all that sort of stuff. Today, I'm excited for our first guest to be Joe DiNardo. He's the co-founder and chief operating officer at Syndicate. And we're going to go deep into syndication today. But Joe, could you please give us a quick introduction of you and Syndicate?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. My name is Joe DiNardo. I am a co-founder, and as Dan mentioned, I'm the chief operating officer at Syndicate. Syndicate is a software company. We're Boston-based, and as the name implies, we are a syndication platform, which is curiously, I think, without needing an introduction these days. 5 years ago, when we started the company, syndication was a verb that not many people were familiar with. It hadn't really yet been normalized, I think, in the industry. But today, those things have changed. We're really a distribution platform used by brands and suppliers powering their e-commerce distribution. So most of what we focus on is on increasing the speed and the quality of data that's moved between a brand and, for instance, a marketplace or a retailer. And we do that through flat file. We do that through API. We've got a number of interesting features that I'd be happy to kind of walk folks through. But that's Syndicate in a nutshell.
Perfect. Thank you. So what we're going to do today is Joe and I are going to talk a little bit about what the challenges are in syndication today. We will take questions at the end of this. If you want to put them into the Q&A, we will take questions at the end, time permitting. We would ask that they're more generic, like if you have a question about a specific retailer or a specific marketplace, we'll handle those. You can contact us offline to be able to do that. But we want to get into this today because I'm really excited to have this conversation. Joe, everybody used to just be worried about getting their products up on their own website. And then COVID happened. And even though there was a big move towards e-commerce capabilities before that, COVID changed the game, obviously. It's now a requirement to do business to have some sort of syndication program. Now that marketplaces and third-party retailers are just as important as e-commerce, what are the big changes that we're seeing right now inside of syndication?
It's a good question. Very broad, which I like because there is a lot in flux right now. All right, where to start? So as you mentioned, yeah, COVID has definitely changed the game. It has, I think, increased the table stakes to selling online. A lot of the folks that we speak to sell both physically, in person, in retail stores and their own flagship stores, but then they also have an e-commerce program. And whether that's 10% of your revenue goal for the year, or whether it's 90% or 100%, distribution in the e-commerce world has become increasingly challenging. As you mentioned, so there's been an increasing, I guess, dominant struggle between D2C and everything else. So selling your goods on your own site is classically fairly straightforward. It's your own website. You own it, you manage it, you maintain it, you have complete control over it. It's going to be tightly integrated with your systems and probably pretty well vetted. Probably got great testing plans in place to make sure that the user customer experience on your own website is a very good one, very high quality. Where we see things start to fall apart a bit is on selling on other websites, on retail websites, on marketplaces. These are websites that a brand or a supplier does not have control over. And so they largely have to conform to the requirements of each one of these other, as we call them, trading partners in the e-commerce network. So that poses some pretty unique challenges. In particular, marketplaces too. That's still a fairly new thing. I know that Amazon here in the States and Walmart have taken market dominance, and it's become quite ubiquitous, especially for people in urban areas. It's kind of a de facto go-to, but that's still a fairly new thing. there's still a lot of adjustment happening behind the scenes that I think really only the e-commerce players are aware of as posing kind of unique challenges. And that those are data challenges, as we're going to discuss today. That's inventory challenges, and overall business challenges too.
So when you look at that, obviously Amazon and Walmart are the big players, but they've been around long enough that there's new upstarts that are coming up as well. So when you look at where your customers are moving to in that new retailer marketplace space, besides the big traditional ones, where is a lot of that movement towards?
I think retailers are seeing a bit of a comeback. And again, this has been very cyclical in an unexpected way, largely because of COVID. As you said, COVID changed everything. I think there are two reasons for that. First off, I think competition has changed dramatically. The barrier to entry of creating a brand, of becoming a manufacturer, is significantly lower today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. So we're seeing this explosion in competition, which has also resulted in a lot less differentiation between brands. There are a lot fewer competitive differentiators, I think. And again, this is very much depends on the type of products we're talking about, right? If we're talking about a stapler is a stapler. If we're talking about a luxury car, there's a lot of differentiation and there's a lot of brand allegiance there. Two very different things. But I think globally, that increase in competition has, again, this has follow-on repercussions going all the way back to the beginning of the supply chain, both the physical supply chain and the digital supply chain. That increase in competition means that customers have become increasingly impatient in their purchasing. We've seen, and we know this to be true, look at the length of ads. Ads used to be 90 seconds long. Now they're 27 seconds long on average, if not less. The same has happened in e-commerce. The average time to purchase, the average time between when a customer begins their online purchase experience to the ultimate checkout, that has decreased dramatically, which means that they're going to familiar places, and they're going to places where they can purchase multiple different products of different types. That's a marketplace. That's a retailer. So whereas D2C used to be a very dominant and very, as I said, it's a very good experience for purchasing, but I think there's been a large shift now back towards retailers and towards marketplaces, which is putting increasing pressure on the brands and suppliers to increase their presence, because that means now that you need to have a selling strategy that involves not just your site, not just a handful of sites, but maybe 20, 30, we oftentimes see 40 or 50 different selling channels that a brand has as part of their core selling strategy.
And one other question on that specific topic, but since you brought up brands, is there's a lot of movement for a while towards store-specific brands or unique brands by retailer. Are we still seeing that based off of that distribution of those 40 to 50 channels that people are selling in? Or are we seeing a move away from that to more universal products?
I think, again, it's a good question. I think it does very much depend on product type, on product category. So I think that the strategy, to use my prior examples, the strategy for someone selling cars is going to be very, very different versus somebody selling office supplies. And similarly, same thing for what customers really demand out of their shopping experience. But either way, I think that that requirement for breadth and depth has increased pretty much universally, pretty much across the board.
Okay. So the name of this webinar, this first episode, is about the complexities that are in syndication and getting rid of some of the mystery around it. We all hear syndication is very complicated. You're talking 40 to 50 channels, and having been part of a program that we were making changes daily to the requirements that our vendors were responsible for, that's one part of the complication. But what are those complicating factors right now beyond just the breadth and the depth?
There are so many. I'm very passionate about this because we've built an entire company around solving this very problem, which I think alone kind of tells you, yeah, this is complicated. Both Gartner and Forrester now, I believe, have quadrants for syndication as its own competitive arena, which again kind of underlines the importance of this and the complexity of it. So where to start? So first and foremost, let's just kind of baseline how this works mechanically. When you go to buy something on a website, you go to buy a t-shirt. Obviously, you can go to a D2C if you like a brand. You can go to that brand.com. You can go to their website and purchase it. If you go to a retailer or to a marketplace, there will be represented a slew of brands, slew of suppliers and manufacturers, but you expect the same purchasing experience. To make that possible, a lot has to happen behind the scenes. PIM data has to be transferred back and forth between the brands and the retailers. PIM, product information management. So that's descriptive information about the product. That includes images, that includes maybe 360 files and video files. DAM information as well, digital asset management type information, that would be the videos and photos that I described. That needs to flow behind the scenes. Pricing information and inventory information has to be in sync all the time. There's a lot of digital coordination that happens. So you might think, okay, well, e-commerce is a fairly real-time industry, right? There's probably a bunch of APIs behind the scenes and computers that are tightly coupled and connected, and this should be a very well-honed process. Reality is it's not quite there yet. There are a lot of APIs out there, but this is a spreadsheet-dominated industry, and it gets worse from there. I mean, we see CSV files, we see fixed precision files, we see a lot of EDI, especially state.
If you remember when I talked about I was on the team that set up those requirements, I also set up a spreadsheet inbounding system for data at that retailer that it's got to be 9 to 10 years old now, that apparently some departments are still using at that retailer. So when you talk about spreadsheets being dominant, it's amazing how clingy some of the people are from a process perspective to those spreadsheets. So sorry I interrupted, but I just wanted to bring that up as a real example of how that occurs.
It's like I said, spreadsheet dominated, and I don't see that changing probably ever. Definitely not within the near future. So that's kind of one struggle. So if you want to go and sell on, I'll just use generic names. You want to sell on retailer A and retailer B. Retailer A will say, great, I need to know information about your products. Here's our setup spreadsheet. Please go fill it out and get it back to me. Retailer B says, you want to sell on our website? Great. Here's our spreadsheet. Please go fill it out and get it back to me. And that obviously takes time. Those two spreadsheets, by the way, look nothing alike. We've seen so many different variants and flavors of the requirements that a retailer or a marketplace has. So you can already imagine how chaotic this can be for a brand to try and manage this. Okay, I've got out my information. It's in my ERP. Maybe I have a PIM platform. Maybe it's in my PIM. Now I need some conversion mechanism to get it into these various formats. I probably need to converge some data too. PIM doesn't classically have pricing information. So maybe I need to take my PIM information, merge it with some information out of my ERP, and then get it into this spreadsheet. And spreadsheets formats 1 and 2. If I'm selling on 40 places, now I've got 40 different formats. It's immediate chaos. 2 additional kind of problems in there. One is, this is not a one and done. This is not like company files its taxes once every year in March. And so there's a big push. This happens all the time, nonstop. I've got a new product. I launch a new product. Now I need to go and fill out some more set up spreadsheets. The other problem is that these requirements change all the time. Most of the time they change without notice, and they're usually breaking changes. Those are the kind of 2 fun things that we've discovered. So for a brand to stay on top of these things is very, very difficult. Whereas if you've got one service provider sitting as a kind of middleman layer in here, and this is part of what we endeavor to do, we can stay on top of those requirement changes and essentially auto-populate. Make sure that our brands are always in compliance with these changing requirements. And sometimes, by the way, those requirement changes aren't just because of the whimsical thought of the day of a retailer or a marketplace. Sometimes those are also regulatory changes. You take like Prop 65 in California, there's been talk of that expanding. If that does happen, which I think is likely, that will result in a number of additional required characteristics, required data attributes to sell something. And that will kind of trickle down all the way down to the brands and the suppliers.
And it multiplies too, because as more companies go global, and there's a lot of global companies out there already, they're not just worried about, well, the spreadsheet formats have to change. They have to worry about the languages have to change. The products that are sellable within certain regions have to change. The pricing data is no longer just in a single currency. So all of that, you look at a country like Switzerland that has 3 to 4 languages that are dominant, that they want the data in 3 to 4 languages from the raw brand rather than just translating it themselves, because then they don't have, the retailer doesn't have to pay the translation services. So there's complications in that. But I think a thing that you brought up that's really important to stress in here too is that confluence of where marketing data hits inventory and pricing data. Okay. And as you know, I've been in the PIM space. That's where we met. I honestly believe anything outside of MSRP does not belong in a PIM, simply because calculable price is not a good place without a specific module in a PIM for pricing. It can't understand contract. It has problems differentiating quantity, and you do contract and quantity together and it just blows the system apart. You need something that's specific to that.
Yeah.
How do you see that evolving in the future? Is this something that it's going to become a single system that's eventually going to be the source of truth, or is it always going to differentiate between the needs of different verticals of data into different sources of truth?
Yeah, good question. A little bit of both. This is definitely, as you've kind of discovered, this is a problem that's already here, and today it's a big challenge, but it's only going to get more challenging. It's only going to get worse. To use your word, yeah, there needs to be this confluence, this gathering of multiple discrete classes of information that need to come together, that need to get glued together in this process of syndicating out to a selling network. I don't think that the answer here is ever going to be one single source of truth for everything. And we've seen a lot of people do this. We've seen a lot of people try to cram pricing information into a PIM, which has its limits, we'll say. That generally doesn't go too well. Pricing has its own extraordinary complications, like you get into most favored nations and custom negotiated discounts. You've also got complexities around e-commerce customer-facing prices versus wholesale prices. And then you've got wholesale prices for this current selling season versus next selling season, right? And what if somebody issues a purchase order for next selling season? They should be getting a different price. So, and these are things that generally Red PIM is just not designed to do. That's much better left off to other applications. But when it comes time to distribute this information, all of that needs to get glued together. Let's see, what else?
So I want to move on to a different topic after this, but there's one other piece that we talked about, and that's how without these systems being glued together, there's a preponderance of bad data that you can send out to those channels. And we all understand a little bit about what bad data does, but when you look at the ability to be able to audit what's on a website, when you're dependent on spreadsheets to be able to do this, to be able to do syndication, where do you see that auditing starting to come into this process?
Ooh, yeah, I didn't even think to mention this. Okay. One of the reasons that we started was because we were approached by a number of brands and retailers who were at their wits' end. They were equally frustrated, and they said, hey, we have this problem. It's a problem for everybody, this syndication problem. It's painful for brands. It's painful for retailers, both the senders and the receivers. And that was in large part due to data quality issues, data insufficiency. Retailer A would say, here's my spreadsheet, please fill it out. The brand would send something back with half of it filled out. And now begins a back and forth that causes cycle time. We would see these delays, this kind of submit, wait, receive a rejection, make a correction, start all over again. These cycles would oftentimes take 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You can imagine then especially for seasonal products, big problem, right? If you have 4 selling seasons in a year or 5 selling seasons in a year, and you're wasting cycle times of 2 weeks and you're going through 3 cycles of that, you are now halfway into the selling season before your products are even listed and available for sale. And if you think of like a bell curve, a distribution curve of purchases over the course of the selling season, if it's a perfectly distributed curve, you're missing out on half of your sales opportunities. But a lot of these curves are actually front loaded, where most of the purchasing is at the beginning of the season. So that loss, even if you're a week or 2 late in getting your products live, it's a very, very big problem. And this is part of why we were approached initially to try and help tackle this very problem.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift us to something that you've already talked about a little bit, but I think that it's important to understand the reality of the situation. And that's how quickly or how not quickly we're going to be looking at API-based syndication versus spreadsheet loads. And you said spreadsheets are here forever. I agree with that. But we're going to see some people at least dabbling beyond just Amazon and Walmart and APIs.
Yeah.
Do you see that as we're going to have a longer lead out for these retailers to get good at the technology to be able to do APIs before we're going to see a preponderance of it? Or is this just going to be a slow trickle as people realize that APIs are just easier to be able to manage from a data perspective?
Yeah, well, this touches on your last question too, which is that because this challenge, this kind of cycle challenge of poor data quality, it's been equally frustrating for retailers. The retailers have tried to go about solving this, and it's amazing to see each of them stumble on the same thing. We've seen this evolution of, okay, we have a spreadsheet format. It's not going well. I know, we'll create a portal. And anybody who's on this webinar right now who's a brand is already rolling their eyes because they know just how awful portals have become. It's the retailers look at this as, okay, this now restricts the brand from submitting to me information which is not adequate. So from the retailer's perspective, nothing gets onto my door before it already meets a minimum quality threshold. So the retailers think this is great. The brands think it's an absolute nightmare because it's made for them a process that was already difficult, even more difficult. So that's kind of that intermediary step that we've seen a lot of retailers stumble through before then they say, okay, spreadsheets weren't working well, a portal wasn't working well. I know the thing, I'll create an API. But how many APIs has that retailer created in their existence? 0. So as you can imagine, that's in and of itself usually a pretty big stumbling block too. We've been engaged by a number of retailers and marketplaces who have come to us and said, hey, you guys are kind of industry experts. You've done this a lot. We're in the middle of creating an API. Can we maybe bounce some of this off you? Can we, and we've engaged in a number of private betas with some of these folks, and those APIs need work. So that's why I say, I think people kind of think of APIs as the panacea that's going to fix a lot of things, when in reality, I'm not sure that a lot of the value is there. I'll caveat that with some kind of new things in the market, like Amazon A+. Amazon A+, it's kind of the next thing. For those who aren't aware, it's also, I think Walmart calls it below the fold. They have their own version of this. I think they're changing the name again. It was Rich Media previously. This is a tailorable presentation of your product page. So we also use the acronym WYSIWYG, which is what you see is what you get. Think of like a Word doc, right? Where you go and you can just kind of construct the layout completely. I want an image in the middle. I want some bullet points above it. And then I want a comparison chart beneath it. That's Amazon A+. It is all the rage right now because the conversion rate for customers who land on your page is much higher than people who are just looking at a plain Jane page from yesterday. It's like 10% to 40% higher, very, very large numbers. So everybody wants it. The reason is because you can't really submit that setup in a spreadsheet. That's basically constructing a web page, which can kind of only be done using a web-based application. So I see that as very much necessitating and thriving on API-based connectivity. For everything else, though, for everything that we've been submitting yesterday through spreadsheets, you can submit the same thing through an API, and maybe you get a bit more real-time feedback, but the industry is not quite there yet.
So there's two pieces that I want to talk about out of that. First of all, if there are retailers or marketplaces on this call right now, why would you tell them that portals are a bad idea? You've badmouthed them enough that let's get down into the weeds there. Why are portals bad?
Because it shifts the brunt of the burden back to the brands who are already really struggling with this. And what I've ultimately seen is that the brand's reaction is, okay, if this gets painful enough, then I'll just stop selling on this website. So in a lot of cases, I've seen it not really have the desired outcome or the desired effect. Portals are also, you are actually diverging even further from anything resembling a homogenized process, right? Remember, I said the beginning of this problem was that everybody has their own spreadsheet format. If everybody used the same spreadsheet format, this would be a lot simpler. But when you now introduce a portal into the equation, what you've done is created something that is even more unique and even more specific to you as a retailer, and therefore even more difficult for a brand to navigate. We've seen portals, to use as an example, that have a multi-phased, multi-step submission process. So you submit just a list of UPCs, and then you wait. And then something comes back, and then you use that, layer in a bunch of other information, and then submit that again, which also, by the way, makes this a lot more difficult to automate for the people who are trying to help make this process a little bit less error-prone. We've seen the be overall generally slower in terms of cycle times versus spreadsheets. So I love the idea. I love that the industry is trying to creatively problem solve here. And this is just kind of part of the growing pain of getting through what will always be a highly tailored process. Yeah, that's just kind of some of my thoughts on portals.
Yeah, and again, the retailer that I worked with for not their category specific attribution, but their original setup, they streamlined it into a portal so that they could do both digital and brick and mortar initial data collection, like you said, UPCs and that sort of stuff. But you had 17 tabs you had to go through.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you've made inefficiencies in the process because you can't just copy and paste a row of data that happens to line up. You have to hit all 17 tabs. So they learned that a long time ago and moved away from that, but it's not like they share that data. And one of the reasons why, when you talk, this is the other thing I wanted to talk about, when you talk about why everybody wants unique, well, Amazon really started this, and Google really encourages this through RankBrain, which, if you don't know, RankBrain is the engine behind the index in Google that looks at originality of data. Okay, and if you're copying the exact same data as somebody else, you get penalized in RankBrain. Okay, if Amazon, you put in the same data as you put on your own brand site, they're likely to reject that data because they want the unique SEO off of it. What other instances of that are we seeing evolve out of the market where people are coming up with new reasons why they want that unique data, or is it all just SEO still?
I think it's mostly SEO, yeah, and that will always be the case as far as I've known. This is a very important kind of hits at the question of why is syndication so challenging. Go back to the original days of a very simple sales model. I do physical, in-person, brick and mortar retail, and then I've also got my own D2C website. That kind of led to the genesis of PIMS. PIM was meant to be a place of creating consistency so that my product and product A and product B had a very consistent representation across my brand line. That was kind of part of the original tenet of PIMS, and it was largely built around that D2C experience. This shift towards selling in multiple places requires the exact opposite. As you mentioned, individualism is what wins on the internet. Your ability to differentiate how this product is presented on retailer A versus retailer B is going to go a long way into determining how favorably you are looked on by the internet powers that be, right? Mainly search and rank engines. So that's definitely not changing. If anything, it's getting a little bit tighter in terms of restriction. This also plays into that question, right? Because in syndication, if I have 40 or 50 different websites that I'm trying to sell on, I now need to come up with 40 or 50 different slight variations of my descriptive content tailored to those channels, hopefully in an intelligent way, to try and assist that SEO differentiation. We're definitely seeing a move further in that direction. This concept of hyper localization is arising. And we're doing this right now using AI. I know AI is just, it's also one of those things that people say they do a lot, but AI actually does this very, very well. We've got a submodule where you can take your product information and say, here's my product. Dear AI, please take this content. I'd like you to tailor it to a specific audience. Teenagers in the US Southwest who enjoy college football. And AI is great at this. It'll take your 256 character description and tweak it ever so slightly. It'll kind of give it a persona that matches that target audience. If you think about this now in higher levels, that's extremely helpful with tailoring your content to not just the distribution channel, but the audience as well. That's kind of a two-dimensional matrix of requirements. Again, these are increasing complexities in this battleground for competitive sales.
Okay. So again, I'm going to move to another thing that we've
Yep.
talked about, which is marketplaces.
Yep.
Because nobody can deny there's an influence of marketplaces, but how long is this a fad? Is this a reaction that is going to have a counter reaction? What do you see as the future of marketplaces in globally and in the US?
Yeah, they're definitely, I'll speak to the US first. They're definitely here to stay. Amazon was, I think, pretty universally understood as the first and probably the most mature. And we've seen a number of others pop up, largely built around the same model, like Walmart. They have a marketplace as well. It works quite well. They have their own unique challenges, but they have definitely become, their stickiness level is very, very high in terms of purchasing acumen. And again, going back to my comments earlier in terms of it depends on the product category. I'll use myself as an example. If I'm buying rock climbing gear, I'm probably not going to buy that on a marketplace. I probably have a brand allegiance. I'm very opinionated. This is gear that requires safety, and so I'm unlikely to make a lot of comparison shopping. Where I might otherwise, though, if we're talking about toothpaste, something that's cheap and undifferentiated, and I just need it at some point delivered to my doorstep, that's a great purchase for a marketplace. And so I think for kind of consumables and things like that, especially lower priced items, I think marketplaces will always have a very, very strong presence in the market. I think also we've seen a little bit move back to retailers away from marketplaces as of late. And we were just talking about this yesterday. We had a small panel discussion with some very large industry players who said they're seeing a lot of that kind of contraction away from marketplaces back to retailers, specifically because of manipulation. And I'm sure we're all familiar with going on a product, seeing that it's got 2,400 5-star reviews, and then you start reading the reviews, and it's quite clear that these are not real ratings. They're not real reviews. It's a problem. Everybody's aware of it. It's a very big problem, and it mostly impacts marketplaces. So I think that has reduced consumer confidence to at least a measurable degree, enough to where some consumers are starting to consider, okay, maybe I should go back to my old habits of going to a retail site to make this purchase.
So real quick, I'm just gonna to the audience. I see there are some questions. We will get to the questions that you have after we go through. There's just a couple more sections I want to go through with Joe, and then we'll answer your questions. So please be patient and continue to put questions into the Q&A section. We will get to those at the end. So thank you for the people that have already asked questions. I think, yeah, we know Amazon's here to stay. We know Walmart's marketplace is not going to go away. Target is getting some traction on Target Plus. Um,
Mhm.
is is there going to be a barrier to entry to new marketplaces based off of what you've stated? Is it going to be more difficult for retailer Z to create a marketplace that has any sort of velocity compared to the marketplaces that already exist?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, as a software company, when we size things, we say is this small, medium, large. What you're describing is none of those. That's a mega. That's big. That's very, very big. There are a lot of challenges in trying to forget about launching, even just maintaining a marketplace. One of which I described, right, which is that they're subject to that kind of manipulation. It's a little bit of a free for all. By design, a marketplace is a gathering of buyers and sellers, and it is meant to be as broad as possible. By design, a marketplace is meant to be meant to not be picky in terms of which buyers and sellers are here, but that can create some very real challenges in terms of maintenance. So I think the number of marketplaces, of major marketplaces, is unlikely to change a lot over the course of the next few years. I do think, as I said, the importance of distributing to retailers will be a little bit more of a focal point. But I think, and this is a good thing, I think, for everybody, frankly. Globally, you've got maybe a dozen or so major marketplaces. I see that as maybe that will 2x over the next 5 years or so. But I don't think you're going to see an explosion of it to where we're going to have 3,000 marketplaces that everyone needs to keep pace with.
Okay. One last thing on this that I'd like to get your viewpoint on. Amazon has shifted back and forth between we want DVS versus we want our own inventory so we can control data versus we don't have to warehouse and those sorts of things. Do you see a lot more of those marketplaces struggling with the idea of we're going to have to go to a DVS model, simply a direct vendor ship model, simply because we don't have the warehousing, we don't have the capacity? Or are we going to see, and is that going to happen to Amazon, where they're strictly going to have to go to, they control the inventory to control the data quality to be able to make sure that they're getting the SEO match that they're looking for? Where do you see marketplaces heading from that perspective?
The marketplaces, I think, will always continue to operate in kind of a blended model. They kind of power dynamic. They generally have a lot of power. And so we've typically seen that type 1P type models versus 3P. A marketplace can cherry pick products and say that because they already have all the numbers, they know the sales numbers, and they can say, okay, this product is very consistent seller. The satisfaction is high, the return rates are low. I'd like to own inventory on that because I can make a higher margin and it's a very low inventory risk. But I don't want to take the full lineup from this brand because they've also got a lot of speculative new to market products, and I don't want to carry that inventory risk. So there's a little bit of a hot potato, and there always will be in the industry, of who wants to have inventory. And it's not just inventory risk. It kind of goes both ways. You want to make sure that you don't understock as well as overstock. So I think this is a very important part of a marketplace's strategy, is making sure that they kind of get max value there. It's the same as for a brand as well. This concept of managing inventory. It has been an enormous struggle with COVID. We also manage a lot of inventory type data feeds. So we see a lot of the raw shipping numbers coming across the seas, generally into the US. We see those import numbers. We all know about, I think it was about a year ago, when the port of LA, the largest port in the US, had 73 ships just doing circles because there was no space in the port for them to land inventory. These are major challenges for the entire industry right now. We've gone through sections here of under inventory, over inventory, under, and now we're back into, I think, generally an over inventory position as we're entering this recessionary cycle. The one last thing I might mention on there too is that inventory challenges for business leaders need to be thought about all the way at the beginning. Go back to my example of selling a seasonal product and these challenges of syndicating product data. You can't sell something if the site you're trying to sell it on doesn't have information about it, right? So until you work out the kinks of getting those sales done, you're going to be dead in the water. If you start missing out on the beginning of the selling season because you're still struggling to get your products live, you're still struggling to syndicate product data, you are creating an inventory challenge. That means that you are almost certainly going to end that season over inventory. And now you've got to make some very difficult decisions. Do I liquidate this inventory? Does that potentially change the reputation of my brand? Does that potentially change the purchasing behavior of my customers to where they now expect a discount at the end of the season, and so they hold out, and then they go and try and get that discounted product on a discount website where I'm now subjected to competition across a broader range of brands, which I was not previously subjected to because I had good brand allegiance. It was a D2C shopping experience, but now in the discount space, I'm not nearly as competitive. So you can kind of see how we're talking about early in the digital supply chain challenges, but those very much ripple through and sometimes magnify to create data challenges later in the supply chain, physical challenges later in the physical supply chain.
Perfect. Okay, so I want to move on to where we're going to get more complex in this. And this is the future. What's the big things that are going to happen next? Realizing we're already talking about a completely non-standardized formatting and data controls perspective. We'll answer Stefan's question on that in a minute. But what do you see the next things? You've already talked about A+ content, and I think that's a good place to start. But what is the next big thing in syndication?
Yeah, we touched on those lightly. A+, and if you kind of give it a broad name of below the fold, rich media, whatever you want to call it, that is definitely a very big thing. It's not quite here yet. Some of the major providers offer methods and mechanisms to manage that control it syndicated properly. But even a lot of that still needs to be, I think it's probably a year from now that's really going to become a mainstream item. AI, as I mentioned as well, that is a big entrant into this space. It's also being used in translations. Go back to your translation example. That was a really good one with Switzerland. We have customers and prospects who talk to us about Switzerland all the time. And it's not just Switzerland, a lot of countries in Europe where I want to sell 10 products at a retailer in Switzerland. But for the first 3 products, I want those to be listed in Swiss French. And the next 4 products, I want those to be listed in German, because even though it's on the same retail website, the types of customers who are going to be purchasing that, their native tongue may be different. That's a real challenge. And of course, making sure that translating if the native English language or the native language is different, making sure that those translations are of high quality and staying on top of that, very difficult. Also, a great use of AI. This is, again, like generative AI, this is a perfect use case for those kinds of things. I also touched briefly on hyper localization. That also, what I just described in terms of language translations, that hyper localization is an increasing focus.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing for me, because when you talk about personalization, there's been a lot of personalization promises made by CMS tools, e-commerce tools, AI tools. That just-in-time personalization is a big deal, because it's not something that's there yet that I've seen somebody do at scale. And the ability to be able to tailor a product description to a specific customer in real time is really appealing, because I no longer have to do the work of the differentiation the way that I used to have to do it. Now I just have to make sure my keywords to tie it to specific customer segments, specific personas are there. And that's interesting, because it's going to change the way that we have to collect the data to be able to reinforce those personalization elements on top of those descriptions and titles and feature bullets.
I see this as a huge opportunity for the industry. If you think about fashion, flash fashion became a thing, right? Without going into the names, there's some major providers out there these days where they create something, it goes on their shelves, and 3 weeks later it ceases to exist. It is hyper ephemeral. I see the same thing. Again, like the digital supply chain generally mirrors what is happening on the physical supply chain. So this concept of hyper localized data and hyper ephemeral data too is going to become increasingly important. Not just localization to the channel that you're selling on, but more importantly, to the target audience that's buying on that. And I'll add in one more dimension, which is time. we're seeing a lot of when people have a good syndication program in place, it's not just I have to get all of this done for the next season and then I can take a break. No, they're doing this every single day. They're sending out data that's tailored to what's happening in the world, either the news or the weather or upcoming holidays, right? Take flash sales like a Father's Day or Mother's Day sale, tailoring your content to orient your audience towards, hey, this is something that you may be interested in purchasing as a gift for this thing that's happening right now. That's very difficult to do unless you have a very good, mature syndication program in place.
And it's interesting because I'm not going to name names either, but if you do the research, you can find out what happens when that system doesn't work. There are piles of clothing in the Chilean desert that were fast fashion that they just had to dump there because they can't go in recycling because they contain bleach and dyes. And they can't sell them because the capital that they restrain by keeping them in the stores to clearance them avoids new products coming in, which backs up the chain, which means they just literally need to dump these wherever they can. So that fast fashion example is really great because when it works really well, it works really well. But when it doesn't, you end up with mountains of clothing sitting in a Chilean desert.
Which is why it's even more important to keep coordinated your digital strategy with your inventory strategy, right? Because you don't want to have a situation where your marketing team executes a brilliant marketing campaign that results in zero inventory across the board. And now maybe that was right before the November holidays. And so now maybe you're missing out on a lot of customer opportunity there too. So coordinating those, and again, these are digital challenges. That digital coordination is definitely something that I think we're going to see coming up a lot more frequently in the next year or two.
Yeah. So I want to make one more statement that I want to get your opinion on, and then we're going to go to questions. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you and I have talked, and one of the things that I think that people have to understand is that syndication is no longer a project. It's a program.
Yeah.
Okay. And it being a program, you can try to do it yourself, but there are experts on being able to help build that program from both a tool and a services perspective. And what's your viewpoint on that?
I love the terminology. Yeah, I really like that. Project is something that's kind of a point in time. It has a finite beginning and end. A program does not, right? A program, it's a cycle, and it's something that requires a higher degree of coordination, of strategy, and of forward thinking, which syndication definitely does. And I think companies tend to find this out. They tend to discover it maybe the hard way, where they try to sell on 3 websites, and okay, it's a project, and then they try to sell on 10. Okay, now it's a big project. And then they decide, okay, that's all going well. I want to sell on 40 websites. And that's absolutely not a project anymore.
Right. And the reason I bring this up is because when you have the right tool set in place, it turns you from a company that is launching products to a company that is optimizing products. So you're always going to have to be in a launch cycle. Yeah. But if you're not going to that optimization step, you're wasting the tool set that is available to maximize your capital outlay on inventory, your efforts for how you're drawing customers to your products, not just on your own website, but on all the websites you're selling on. And that has returns to it in A+ content, in being able to take advantage of brand ambassador programs, all that sort of stuff. So I'm a big proponent for program over project. I don't think project is sustainable, even in the 3 channel thing that you talked about, trying to go to 3 websites or 3 marketplaces. Even at that point, if you're ever going to get to optimization, you have to be in program mentality.
Completely agree. Yeah, and I think the critical component there that really differentiates the 2 is strategy. Right. I think projects typically are executed based on an initial mandate, and then it's done. Whereas a program requires ongoing strategy. Just getting products listed online. Some companies may make that mistake of saying, okay, well, I actually have my products listed online and they're selling, and so I think things are going well. When realistically, there may be a lot of opportunity left on the table of, okay, you're selling on Amazon, but are you using A+? Did you know that your conversion rates might be 10%, 20%, or more than that higher if you can submit content more frequently, more accurately. The requirements are higher, but this is a risk reward trade-off. So I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of folks, is thinking about these things over the next couple of years, planning ahead strategically to compensate for how this competitive landscape is going to change. A+ again being a great example of changing table stakes to list and to win sales online. That requires a bit of forward thinking and really kind of e-commerce leadership.
Perfect. So I want to get to questions. We've got about 7 minutes left. So Stefan's questions came up first, and I have an opinion on this. I want to get your opinion first. But he's talking about what about product classification standards like GPC, UNSPSC, ETIM, E-Class? What are they going to do to standardize the formats of data?
Great question. By the way, thanks to everybody who asked questions. I'd love to see that. Yeah, there's, as you already mentioned, it's kind of acronym soup. Amazon has their own, right? That's the ASIN. Then there's some global standards like a G10, like a UPC. It's getting more complicated. That's another thing that I've seen. I've seen companies, major market companies that are well-funded, try to solve this by creating one standard. I have seen governments try to standardize this. I've seen not-for-profits try to create trading panels that have tried to standardize this, and there's some of that out there, but by nature, this is an open forum of competition, and those generally don't lend very well to standardization. So I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for a while, especially you look at like the GDSN network, that creates some unique challenges around specificity and identification.
Yeah, and I honestly believe that those standards help to be able to define what a product is. And we may see some movement towards those classifications becoming more universal, but the schemas, the attribution that they ask, both from a holistic global perspective that's asked on every product and the category specifics, are going to remain the Wild West for a significant amount of time, partially because of the differentiation, partly because it is really hard for a monolith company like Walmart or Amazon or Target to just agree to a sudden shift to a standard that everybody else is using. It's just going to be difficult for that to be the predominant way that people make that change. Now, Jennifer asked, is the predominant way that people are searching for individual product pages coming from Google, or are they more going to the specific distributors? Because that uniqueness piece helps on Google, but where do searches start nowadays? And I can tell you there's anecdotal evidence that I remember that said that like 40 to 45% of searches for products in the consumer space start on Amazon, not on Google. But I'm not up to date on that. Do you have any more relevant statistics for that?
The same one that I had in my head. I've heard that number before too. 40% of searches for a consumer product start on Amazon. It's a staggering number. It's almost like they have become the Google of e-commerce. So yeah, I mean, definitely take that into consideration depending on the types of things that you sell, because that's probably where a lot of your consumers are starting. It's not half or more than half, but it's pretty darn close.
Perfect. So Rakesh had a question, and he's talking about value-added resellers. There are many retail segments where we need an aggregator or specialized reseller, and a generic marketplace model won't apply. What are the possibilities of having many specialized aggregating VARs as an alternative to those generic marketplaces?
Yeah, that's interesting. That has come up too as its own strategy in of itself. And again, managing that both digitally and inventory wise, both digitally and physically, is completely different, I think, strategically versus managing a relationship with a marketplace. Yeah. You do get to offload some of the complexities to the value-added reseller, but that also comes at, from what I've seen, the cost of, again, some more digital complexities in terms of interacting with that entity, and making sure then that the representation, once it gets into the land of the value-added reseller, is consistent with your desired messaging for your brand.
Cool. So Frederick asked a question about knowledge graphs and how could they help with a knowledge representation that helps with that end-to-end multi-channel challenge?
I might ask you for clarification on the knowledge graph side.
I think he's looking at the technology of knowledge graphs themselves, building ontologies to be able to help
Yeah.
with building the relationships and the categorizations and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Is that I see that as a supplement to the existing PIM tool functionality as and the syndication functionality, not a replacement for it. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Good. Okay. I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. Definitely a supplement. Yep. Definitely not part of kind of the core, but also one of those challenges that we've seen once you get into the details, this becomes subjective and not objective. So very difficult to try and automate. Great example would be hierarchies. If you look at the Amazon hierarchy of product categories, if you look at it, especially as a consumer, you might think that it is tree structured. We do a lot in footwear. So underneath shoes, you might have hiking shoes, right? And dress shoes. That's not actually the way it works behind the scenes. Dress shoes is a category and hiking shoes is a category. Shoes as that kind of top level doesn't exist. So it doesn't quite have the tree structure that you might otherwise think. That's just an example. Each marketplace and retailer handles this very, very differently. And so some people have gone and tried to map all of these to each other. And that is very challenging, but more so problematically because these also change. I believe Walmart's in the middle of changing this completely, which is, again, this is part of the detail that I think brands really struggle with, trying to keep pace with these changes.
So we have one more question. I want to try to get a really quick answer to it. Is it worth setting up a data lake for Syndicate feeding into an AI or an LLM engine? Is it better to build virtual data pipes to store a lot of data? And honestly, building an aggregation system beyond the aggregation systems that already exist, I'd look at that from a cost benefit ratio perspective. If you could direct feed from a system, why build an aggregation to feed into another system? If you already have a middleware, why do that? I think there's pros and cons to that, but the cons tend to be more on the cost side of just setting up another aggregation system on top of the aggregation systems that you already have. We are going to run out of time here. We got through all the questions. Sorry, there's one more question, but we're not going to have time. It came in at the last second. But thanks, everybody. Thank you very much, Joe. I could talk forever. We could have this conversation for hours and hours. We got through a lot in an hour. I thank you for being my first guest. Next month, we're going to be talking about AI in product data and generation and aggregation of data based off of AI elements. So I hope that's a good topic for everybody. If you have other questions, please reach out. And this recording will be online if you want to share it with other people. But I really appreciate you taking the time, Joe. I know you're a very busy man, and I really appreciate you doing this with me.
Thanks, Dan. Always love to talk shop. Thanks for having me on the webinar. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And everybody else, thank you for taking the time. And we will answer the remaining questions that just came out individually afterwards. So thank you, everybody, for your time. And I hope to see you again next month.
Thanks, folks.